In September 2010, a Chinese fishing trawler collided with two Japanese Coast Guard vessels near the disputed Senkaku Islands. Within weeks, Japan's high-tech manufacturing ground to a halt. Toyota, Sony, and Panasonic couldn't finish building hybrid cars, smartphones, or flat-screen televisions because the components they needed simply disappeared from the global market. China had cut off Japan's supply of rare earth elements without firing a single shot. The island nation that supplied 97% of the world's rare earths had demonstrated a form of economic warfare that made traditional sanctions look primitive. This wasn't military power. This was something far more effective. History teaches us that controlling strategic resources grants nations the power to reshape geopolitics without military force. But there's a crucial difference between the weapon America has traditionally wielded and the one China has perfected over the past 2 decades. The United States has historically used embargoes to deny adversaries access to American products and resources, a strategy of exclusion that punishes enemies. China has inverted this logic entirely. Instead of denying others what it possesses, China has systematically positioned itself as the indispensable supplier of materials the entire world desperately needs. This isn't just about having resources. It's about controlling the manufacturing and processing of materials that modern civilization cannot function without. To understand the power of strategic resource control, we must look back to August 1941. President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 8832, freezing Japanese assets and imposing a total oil embargo on Imperial Japan. At that moment, Japan imported 80% of its oil from the United States. Within hours of the embargo, Japan lost access to 88% of its imported oil supply. The Imperial Japanese Navy calculated it had less than 2 years of fuel reserves remaining. This single economic decision created an impossible choice for Japanese leadership: submit to American demands or secure alternative oil supplies by force. 5 months later, Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor. The oil embargo hadn't prevented war. It had accelerated the timeline toward conflict because Japan faced economic strangulation. This American strategy followed a clear pattern: control a resource your adversary needs, then deny them access to force compliance. It worked because America possessed what others required. But this weapon has a fundamental weakness. It only functions when you control production of the resource itself. And that's where China rewrote the entire playbook. China studied this historical lesson and drew a different conclusion. Rather than using denial as a weapon, China spent 30 years methodically capturing control of the resources and manufacturing processes that power modern economies. The scale of this achievement is staggering. As of 2024, China controls 76% of global lithium-ion battery production. It manufactures 85% of the world's solar panels and processes 92% of solar cells globally. China produces more than 30% of all manufactured goods on Earth, more than the next 9 countries combined. But the real strategic brilliance lies not in finished products, but in the upstream materials that make everything else possible. China mines 70% of the world's rare earth elements and refines over 90% of them. These 17 metallic elements, with names like neodymium, dysprosium, and terbium, are irreplaceable components in smartphones, electric vehicles, wind turbines, and precision-guided missiles. Without rare earths, the F-35 fighter jet cannot fly and the Prius cannot drive. The dominance extends far beyond rare earths. China controls 94% of global gallium supply and 83% of germanium, both critical for semiconductor manufacturing. It produces 80 to 90% of the active pharmaceutical ingredients that American drug companies need to manufacture antibiotics, pain relievers, and life-saving medications. China supplies up to 95% of the ibuprofen used in the United States and Europe. In July 2023, China announced export controls on gallium and germanium, requiring licenses for all shipments. Within months, gallium prices surged 20% in the United States and Europe. China's export controls on graphite, antimony, and tungsten have followed the same pattern. Each announcement sends shockwaves through global supply chains. The 2010 incident with Japan was merely a test run. After the fishing boat collision, China halted rare earth exports to Japan for 2 months. Prices for rare earth elements increased more than 400%. Japanese manufacturers scrambled desperately for alternative supplies that barely existed. China controlled the choke point completely. The United States Department of Defense has identified a sobering reality. America depends on Chinese supply chains for components used in 1,900 weapon systems, encompassing over 80,000 individual parts. 78% of U.S. military weapon systems contain materials potentially vulnerable to Chinese supply disruption. This isn't theoretical. It's documented in official Department of Defense assessments and Government Accountability Office reports. China implemented this strategy through methodical industrial policy, particularly the Made in China 2025 initiative launched in 2015. This 10-year plan explicitly targets 10 strategic sectors, including aerospace, robotics, artificial intelligence, and advanced materials. The goal isn't merely economic growth, it's achieving dominant market position in technologies that define 21st century power. The plan is working. By 2030, China is projected to control over 60% of the world's refined critical mineral supply. It already holds 67% of global electric vehicle manufacturing capacity. China's manufacturing capacity for solar panels exceeds 165% of total global demand. It can produce more solar panels than the entire world needs. This creates a strategic vulnerability that traditional military strength cannot solve. You cannot bomb your way out of dependence when your own military systems require materials only your adversary can supply. The United States learned this lesson when it discovered that over 35 crucial minerals extracted domestically or in allied nations are sent to China for processing because no alternative refining capacity exists. American policymakers have begun responding. The CHIPS and Science Act allocated $52 billion to rebuild domestic semiconductor manufacturing. The Inflation Reduction Act incentivizes domestic battery and solar panel production. But building processing facilities for rare earth elements takes 8 to 10 years. Requires billions in capital investment, and faces environmental regulations that China largely ignores. China spent 3 decades and hundreds of billions of dollars building this position. It subsidized money-losing operations, accepted environmental damage, and played the long game while Western nations focused on quarterly profits. Now China doesn't need to threaten. It merely needs to remind the world who controls the valve. The most powerful economic weapon isn't the one that denies adversaries what you have. It's the one that makes adversaries dependent on what only you can provide. America's oil embargo against Japan was a blunt instrument that provoked war. China's control of critical supply chains is a scalpel that makes war unnecessary. Here's the deeper truth that most analysis misses. China didn't build this dominance through military conquest or resource hoarding. It achieved it through patient industrial policy, massive state investment, and willingness to absorb losses for strategic gain. While Western companies optimized for efficiency and profit margins, China optimized for control and long-term positioning. The United States remains the world's most powerful military force and largest economy. But military strength and GDP don't matter when your adversary controls the materials required to build batteries, manufacture semiconductors, and produce pharmaceuticals. This isn't about trade balances or market competition. It's about structural dependency embedded into the supply chains of modern civilization. The real question isn't whether China will use this weapon. It already has, repeatedly. In 2010 against Japan, in 2025 with export restrictions on critical minerals. The question is, what happens when a crisis forces China to choose between its economic interests and its geopolitical objectives? Every smartphone, electric vehicle, wind turbine, and advanced weapon system contains materials that travel through Chinese-controlled supply chains. We've built a global economy where the world's second largest power holds the switch. And unlike the American oil embargo that pushed Japan toward war, China's strategy makes confrontation economically unthinkable for its adversaries. That's not just a successful economic weapon. That's the redesign of global power itself, where control matters more than denial, where patience defeats aggression, and where the factories that make the components are worth more than the armies that deploy them. China understood what the United States demonstrated in 1941. Strategic resources are leverage. But China also understood something America didn't, that being the supplier is more powerful than being the withholder. The economic weapon China uses better than the United States isn't a weapon at all in the traditional sense. It's a deliberately constructed system of dependency that makes economic warfare unnecessary because the alternative to cooperation is collective industrial collapse. And that might be the most effective deterrent ever created. The question now is whether the West can rebuild what it abandoned, or whether this shift in power is already permanent.